What does it mean for Christians to battle against pornography today? This is Dispatches from the Culture War. I'm MD Perkins. I was recently invited to speak in an event put together by the Protect Child Health Coalition. This is a group of various other pro-family groups. AFA is not necessarily represented within that group. This was a connection that we've made very recently. But I believe that this group is mostly comprised of smaller efforts within states and local jurisdictions to try and confront issues, particularly of pornography, comprehensive sex education, and these issues that currently impact children. Now, it's not a particularly religious group. There's a mix of different people represented there. But the name of the group, the Protect Child Health Coalition, has really gotten me thinking about some questions regarding how do we protect children in this day and age, and what are some practical things that people are currently doing to confront the weak points in our current society regarding the protection of children. One thing I want to bring up is something that AFA was involved in, and it's being able to conduct something called shareholder activism, where an individual or a group, as shareholders of a particular company's stock, now have access to speak into policy decisions that are happening at shareholder meetings regarding corporate policy on certain issues, and be able to bring up their concerns and hopefully shift some things in a good direction. And this recently happened with the company Apple, and AFA was involved in that. And even though I was recently asked to speak on this on Dr. Nurse Mama's show, I'll give a link to that, I think a better representative of this viewpoint is actually going to be Walker Wildman, the CEO of AFA Action and the Vice President of American Family Association. So I'll let Walker explain the context of how AFA got involved in this issue and the particular cases or the particular issues that they were able to bring up and address, and the victory that was able to be had there with Apple.
We've been presenting these shareholder proposals that are aimed at advancing pro-family values in America's largest corporations. One of those proposals took place earlier this year, and it had to do with the Apple Corporation, which, if you haven't heard of Apple, I don't know where you've been, but we've been engaging with these companies through the shareholder proposal process with the goal of advancing pro-family values in America's corporate boardrooms. So one of the proposals that we put forth was regarding child sexual abuse material, otherwise known as CSAM. And Apple, early in 2020, 2021, Apple was planning on, or at least in discussions, to deploy CSAM, child sexual abuse material, scanning software in their cloud environment. So if you have an iCloud account, they were going to scan photos to ensure that child sexual abuse material wasn't being stored in the iCloud environment. Well, they ended up ditching the project, ditching the efforts, didn't deploy it. And there were some possibly legitimate privacy concerns around deploying CSAM scanning software in the iCloud environment. Apple said it could be used to scan for other legal content and could have some free speech and privacy concerns. Whether or not that's true or not, we can debate that. That's a subject for another day. But we wanted Apple to look into the legal and financial risk associated with not deploying the scanning software, because anybody who's in the space and studies and works on the subject of protecting children, and specifically preventing the distribution of child sexual abuse material, which is a very serious crime, we wanted to know, why wasn't Apple doing more on this front? And so we put forth a proposal. We got about almost 7% of the shareholders to vote in favor of our proposal, which I understand that doesn't sound like a lot, and it's far from even 50%. But in the shareholder engagement world, that was a pretty big deal to get 7% of shareholders on board with our proposal. And so we had multiple meetings with Apple leading up to it. They wanted us to pull the proposal. And we had multiple meetings with them, and we were basically trying to get them to do more, to protect minors on their devices. One of the things that came up as we were doing our research into Apple and how their accounts are set up on the iPhones and the iPads and the computers is there's parental controls that parents can put into place for all minors under their account. All the children on your Apple account, you can put in different parental controls. Well, one of the parental controls is called communication safety. And with communication safety, we realize that children age, let's say 1 to 13, they would have the most rigorous standards and the most rigorous safety protocol in place on their account. And children couldn't even view what the device detects as pornographic imagery using the Messages app. Those images were blocked, and there was no way for the child to view them. So the children are basically, if you're age 1 to 13, protected from viewing harmful pornographic material through the Messages app, all right? The vulnerability we uncovered as part of these discussions with Apple about how they can do more to protect children, what we uncovered is that children age 14 to 17, they could actually view and distribute pornographic material, pornographic images and videos using the Messages app on the iPhone or on the Apple device without parental knowledge or without parental consent. So no passcode needed, etc. You just simply bypass the disclaimer, and then boom, before you know it, your 14-year-old, your 16-year-old is viewing explicit pornographic images and videos on their iPhone without your consent, even though they're a minor. This is even though they're a minor. They're under the age of 18. So we view that as like a complete no-brainer that Apple should be able to fix this. There is no reason, and I told Apple executives this. I said there is zero, and I did all caps in my email to Apple. I said there is zero reason for you to have this double standard for those 13 and under and those 14 to 17. There is no legal or moral reason for you to treat those two minor groups differently. And so I guess my email resonated. And I told him, I said, if there's a reason that you think a 14-year-old should be viewing pornography without their parents' consent, without their parents' knowledge on the Apple device, please make the case. Let's hear the case. I would be interested to hear the case. Of course, crickets. But we're pleased to announce that not even a year after those engagements and after putting forth another proposal this upcoming year, which Apple once again wanted us to rescind, Apple has made changes on their devices to where all minors 17 and under have the same communication standards and the communication safety standards on by default to where they are protected from harmful content. And their parents, amen. Just like that. Amen. And their parents will have to, will be notified if they choose to try to bypass those safety standards. And so this is a very big deal, a very big victory. I wrote an op-ed over at afn.net where you can read more about kind of the inside baseball on this announcement.
See, this represents part of the challenge of trying to address these things in a digitized age. You know, you think back to some of the battles against pornography in the 80s and 90s that AFA was involved in. You can understand more about that if you go to culturewarrior.movie and watch the documentary that I made about Don Wildman and the battle for decency. But what that explains is how there were so many pornography had been so widely proliferated across society, but it was limited initially in just certain avenues where you had to go to an adult movie house or an adult bookstore in order to access this material. But then what began to happen with the proliferation of popular magazines like Playboy and Penthouse and Hustler and some of these other pornographic magazines is it mainstreamed pornography, and where these things were being sold just on bookshelves at drugstores or at the airport, newsstands, convenience stores, all of these different places were treating these as just like normal magazines, like you pick up an issue of Time or Newsweek or something. You could also access magazines like Playboy and Penthouse and others that were much more raunchy and much more problematic and graphic in its depictions. And so one of the things that Don and, of course, many other pro-family leaders got involved in were to boycott some of the establishments to try and get them to remove their magazines. Now, of course, in the history of AFA, boycott was always a last resort. It was something that you were going to, after all other avenues of discussion and confrontation had been met and, tried. But once you couldn't get anywhere else, then it was time for consumer action to really be the thing that was going to hopefully generate some sort of response on the part of these companies. And that's what AFA ended up doing. It was still called the National Federation for Decency in the mid-'80s. And so campaigns against 7-Eleven as probably, Don saw that it was actually the largest seller of Playboy and Penthouse magazines in the country. And so because of that, he believed that if impact could be had there would be all of these other ripple effects from other companies that begin to take notice of what this industry leader was doing. And in this case, it actually kind of worked in opposite, where there were a lot of other smaller convenience stores, gas stations, and other things in all of these different areas that began to be impacted as citizens got concerned, would write letters to the managers of these stores and to the CEOs of these companies, trying to persuade them of the harmful impact of pornography within their local communities, and therefore urging them to remove the sale of these magazines. The first step was just to put those behind the counter to where someone couldn't just go up and pull the magazine off the shelf and then bring it forward, but they actually had to engage with a staff person at these establishments in order to gain access. And then, but still, there were different things that you could emphasize at these different points, but the purpose of it was to confront just the very easy access that children had to pornographic imagery and the enticement that was there because it was something kind of mysterious. Maybe it was covered over a little bit where you couldn't see some of the fullness of what was going to be offered within the magazines. It's done in an enticing way. And so, of course, children are very interested, especially if they sense that this is something bad or off limits or something that their parents wouldn't approve of. It raises the curiosity even more to where a child might be even more inclined to look at it or to try and seek out some of these magazines and things. So that was how the battle was fought in the 80s. And, now it feels almost quaint to think that you could have a massive impact on the proliferation of pornography in American society by going after convenience store magazine shelves. But in fact, that's what happened. Of course, as we know, the technology's changed, and the ways in which people could access pornography, the way in which pornography was kind of distributed to American society shifted over the years. And so the battles that we face on these issues have shifted as well. But that doesn't mean that there is no way to fight it. And like Walker was saying, here was a piece of regarding their communications safety standards that you could go after. You could recognize a discrepancy with how they were treating this, and you could at least have them kind of be forced to answer a question of why were they not protecting minors, whereas they clearly recognized children's need to not access this material, but even minors then between the ages of 14 and 17 could still essentially by default have access to this. Of course, parents, guardians, whoever could still, potentially shift those things. But the point was that the parent or guardian had control and were able to set those protections in place. And had to take an extra step in order to remove those protections, whereas in this case, those protections now, because of AFA's shareholder activism, the victory there is that those things are by default already set in place, where there is the extra step to remove it, whereas before there was the extra step to add it, to add that layer of protection. And so does that solve the issue of pornography? Obviously not. But like all of these different issues, they add up. And the corrupting influence of pornography on society is not going to be undone by one single act of legislation or one single act of protest. It's going to take hundreds, if not thousands, of little ways like this, where hopefully people are called to recognize the need to protect children on these various fronts. And so that's really a way that I would like to encourage you, if you're watching this video today, to think about just different ways that we can approach these issues, because the issues have changed, or at least the technology has changed. The issues, the underlying issues remain the same. I mean, you're not going to solve the problem of human lust and the desire to seek out naked flesh, but you can curb some of that and make it less easily accessible for children in particular, but really anyone. I mean, think about age verification laws and some of this discussion that's happening in different states. And what we're finding is that as we push forward on these issues, companies like Pornhub, which is a large pornography distributor, it's not the only one, but it's a major one. I mean, they were so major that they were even in talks to get the naming rights for one of the stadium spaces within Los Angeles. I mean, imagine that. Imagine how mainstreamed pornography would be if you actually allowed Pornhub to have the naming rights of a stadium. But we're kind of on that precipice. So for people who, some of which are not even Christians, but they recognize the damaging impact of pornography, especially now that we've had several generations who've grown up with just internet pornography access at their fingertips. And the long-term ramifications on this, on male sexuality, on male intimacy with females, issues of self-image, body image, comparative attitudes. We have this new language of incel. Well, what is an incel? It's an involuntary celibate. Well, that doesn't mean that this person is not sexually active within the world of pornography. It just means that he's not seeking out female companionship to have those desires fulfilled, because he has everything digitally on a screen that then he can indulge his lust that way. So even that term of incel just comes out of this pornography proliferated society. And so the impact and influence of pornography on our culture is massive. I mean, I remember the movie, the recent Spider-Man from several years ago, where there's a scene where a boy in it is sitting at a computer and he's helping Spider-Man. This is Spider-Man's friend, and he's doing some kind of hacker type stuff on the computer to try and help the hero. And then someone comes in and sees that he's in the computer lab, and his response is, "I'm looking at porn." And that gets a big laugh in the movie theater whenever that played, because it's played for laughs, because that is more believable that this young adolescent would be looking at pornography than that he would be doing something productive. And we're all supposed to just sort of go along and laugh with it, because that is just what young men do. So, bigger picture, what are some ways that we can think about these issues? We mentioned shareholder activism, we mentioned age verification laws. I would just be more aware of issues regarding AI. I had a video about the exploitation of women through the use of AI face swap, deepfake apps, and websites. That is something that can be used to harm children, and it may be used because, it may be able to be implemented in some ways quite innocently, because face swap apps are just kind of fun. They're novel. You can put your face on the body of an animal or on a different person, or you can make your face look older or younger, look like a bunny, whatever. Like all these different things, it's just sort of humorous and light. But when you think about how that could be used for nefarious purposes in child pornography, for instance, I don't know all the issues I don't know all the ways in which there are safeguards in place regarding some of that, but even just AI face swapping apps and software is something that may be used as an entry point, because now essentially, before you had to seek out nude images of people who agreed to present their bodies that way on film. And now you can essentially, through AI software, you can essentially create anyone into a pornographic image if you want to. And that's a frightening proposition. So being aware of things like that. Well, there's several websites that I think may be helpful to people if they want to learn more about some of these issues. I mentioned the Protect Child Health Coalition. ProtectChildHealth.org is the website there. This is a collection of various pro-family activists who are trying to have a difference within, and they have a narrow focus regarding pornography is one of their points of concern. The comprehensive sex education is another point of concern. They have a couple of others, but all of these things kind of center around child health. And so they've got a number of resources on their website that might be helpful to people, especially if you're on the activism front and you really want to find a way to get involved. There might be some helpful items there for you. Protect Young Eyes, protectyoungeyes.com. I'm not deeply familiar with this group. I just found the website the other day, but it looks like they've got a number of resources and guides for tech habits and to help you think through some of these things with kids. Assessing the risks, some tips for parents on addressing some of these things, and just overall having an emphasis of encouraging an analog childhood and helping parents move away from dependence on screens, because that is another aspect of this conversation, is our over-reliance on screens as a means of sating our children, quieting them down, keeping them occupied, essentially being babysitters. It's impossible to go to a restaurant nowadays and not see a kid sitting there with a phone or an iPad, either playing a game or watching something. And, even issues of impatience and learning to wait, we've kind of are removing a level of boredom that is actually good for children, I think. And so all of that kind of factors into setting kids up to seek out more and more of screen-based stimulation. And, I'm not thinking sexually, I'm just saying entertainment-wise. But even that concept can very easily, as they transition into the age of, through puberty and into the age of being a teenager and a young adult, that seeking out image-based stimulation and screen-based stimulation then can very easily take on kind of sexual undercurrents to it, because the expectation is there and their peers are probably engaged in that more and more. I think the average age that a young boy will be exposed to pornography now is age 8. I'm not 100% sure that I'm remembering that accurately, but I do believe that was what I heard, that the average age of exposure for a young boy is age 8. Pornography exposure at age 8. That's the average. So some people are being exposed much later, some even earlier, but 8, that's kind of mind-boggling. But when you consider just how saturated our society is with screens and really just sexualized imagery overall, it's very easy to kind of transition children right into the pornography pipeline. And don't think that the large pornography companies that are making millions, if not billions of dollars, are not interested in sexualizing, in having sexualized content just be normalized across society, because they will be the recipients of that. It's kind of like the way that, in a different context, if you watch a lot of sports, you know that sports betting and gambling is a massive, it's clearly getting a lot of marketing steam behind it from all of these different companies that have set up their own sports books and these sorts of things. And, from what I'm hearing is that a lot of the engagement that young men especially are having with sports is happening through the means and the apparatus of sports betting. And so, of course, the sports leagues are interested in that being a part of it because they benefit with more eyeballs, more interest, more fandom. But it's not just wholesomely enjoying the sport anymore. It's like now it's got to have this monetary betting component to it. And in more and more cases, the way that that's been fractionalized down to where you can even, I think, place bets on individual scores that players are able to do, their individual performance, and all these sorts of things. And there's lots of ramifications on that. But the major sports leagues in this country are interested in sports betting, building up this momentum. And so they found a partnership. I think the large pornography distributors work in a similar way. And the more sexualized our culture and society are, the more likely they are to benefit. If children have an interest in seeking out pornographic imagery, Pornhub and the other major distributors don't really have a problem with that. But as people have emphasized age verification laws, you've actually seen companies like Pornhub move out of operations in these certain states that are more restrictive or really forcing them to have certain age verification things in place and not just say that you're 18 or whatever, but actually provide proof with a government-issued ID and different things like that. So that's another thing. I'll mention a group called NCOSE, NCOSE. That's the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, and their website is insexualexploitation.org. They offer detailed education on these issues. I mean, really helpful studies, current information, current data on from the psychological and medical side to the kind of sociological front of impact of certain policies or allowances or the way that culture is being shaped by different issues of sexual exploitation, from pornography to trafficking and all of these different fronts. So anyway, not a particularly uplifting conversation here today, but I do think that these are important topics, and people sometimes wonder, do Christians even still care about fighting the battle of pornography? Yes, many Christians do care. It's just the battlefront's shifted so heavily because of technology changes that it's kind of been hard to really get our bearings and figure out how we can battle on some of these issues, especially when the pornography industry throughout the 80s and 90s was so heavily involved with the ACLU to make these seem like free speech issues, whereas according to the law, they were really obscenity issues, but even the legal definition of obscenity had become so subjective that it was hard to really even litigate on some of these fronts. And so it made things significantly harder now to deal with it as opposed to then, which was why guys like Don Wildman were speaking up and saying that Christians needed to deal with this. And as a society, we needed to have clearer understanding of some of this because it was going to have long-term ramifications. Well, guess what? We're living with those long-term ramifications now. And so hopefully that gives you a little bit of maybe some things to think about how we might be involved in helping to protect children from the harmful impacts of pornography and sexual abuse material and other things like that will be harmful to childhood psychology, development, and just a normal, healthy life as a childhood and childhood innocence. So